It's time to get started. Are you ready?
Ready, yes.
Yes.
Welcome to today's forum, Peace on the Korean Peninsula in the 21st Century, a roundtable. I'm this evening's host, Moonsu Han, who teaches economics at the university and serves as a member of the Boston chapter of the National Unification Advisory Council, NUAC. This is a live stream event, and we are hosting this forum from the beautiful The Verve Hotel in Boston, Massachusetts. Before getting started this event, there is one important thing I would like to address. If any unexpected thing happens, we'll try to fix it as soon as possible. However, no one knows what's going to happen during the forum, maybe due to the power outage or the strong wind, etc. I hope not, but if that happens, we will record everything and post this event on the YouTube channel of Boston NUAC. Thank you for your understanding in advance. Now we will have pledging flags for the United States of America and the Republic of Korea. Please rise for the flag salute. Ready, salute. Let's have a moment of silence for the people who sacrificed themselves for the peace. Please be seated. Now, welcome speech by Mr. Seung Han, who is the president of the Boston chapter of the National Unification Advisory Council. Please welcome him.
Good evening. My name is Seung Han, President of National Unification Advisory Council, Boston chapter. I would like to welcome everybody participating in the forum tonight, especially Seung Han, Secretary General of NUAC, Jeon, Consulate General of Boston, the Professor Ed Baker from Harvard University, Kee B, Harvard Professor, Edinburgh Mayor Paul Heroux, Harriosn, Executive Director from Mass Peace Action. We prepared this forum for the opinion and discussing the peace on the Korean Peninsula after the election of the President of America. I hope all participants enjoy tonight's event, and after discussion, I expect a lot of questions about the peace of Korean Peninsula. Thank you for the participating panels and the NUAC members preparing tonight's event, especially Professor Jeon, who is a moderator tonight. Thank you again.
The special congratulatory speech by Mr. Seung Hwan Lee, who is the Secretary General of the NUAC. Please welcome him.
존경하는 보스턴 협의회 자문위원 및 재동포 여러분, 그리고 미국 시민 여러분 반갑습니다. 저는 민주평화통일 자문회의 사무처장 이승환입니다. 먼저 코로나19 확산으로 인해 어려운 상황임에도 불구하고 한반도 평화정책 방향을 모색하기 위한 평화통일 포럼을 준비해 주신 한선우 보스턴 협의 회장님을 비롯한 보스턴 협의회 자문위원 여러분들께 감사드리며 행사 개최를 진심으로 축하드립니다. 모두 아시다시피 현재 세계는 코로나 바이러스와 힘겨운 싸움을 벌이고 있습니다. 세계 각국에서 보여주고 있는 위기 극복과 보건의료 협력 노력은 인류가 더 나은 미래로 나아갈 수 있다는 희망을 보여주는 것이라고 생각합니다. 보스턴 협의회도 이번 코로나19 확산을 방지하기 위해 국내 현금 500불과 보스턴 지역사회에 마스크 15,000장을 지원한 것으로 알고 있습니다. 보스턴 지역사회 상생을 위해 헌신과 노고를 아끼지 않으신 보스턴 협의회 자문위원 여러분들께 깊은 감사의 인사 전합니다. 민주평화통일 자문회의 의장이신 문재인 대통령께서는 최근 유엔 연설을 통해 한반도의 평화는 동북아의 평화를 보장하고 나아가 세계 질서의 변화에 긍정적으로 작용할 것이며 그 시작은 한반도 정전선언에 있다고 강조하신 바 있습니다. 또한 정부는 동북아의 평화를 구축하기 위해 2032 서울 평양 공동올림픽 개최 유치를 위해 노력하고 있습니다. 세계인들이 올림픽을 통해 서울과 평양을 동시에 방문하고 즐기는 진정한 평화를 이루기 위한 것입니다. 동포 여러분과 미국 시민 여러분께서도 한반도가 70년의 전쟁을 끝내고 화해와 변형의 시대로 전진해 나갈 수 있도록 힘을 모아 주시기 바랍니다. 아무쪼록 이번 평화통일 포럼이 한반도 평화를 더욱 공고히 하고 한국과 미국 간 협력을 강화하는 실질적 논의의 장이 되기를 기대합니다. 고맙습니다.
The second congratulatory speech by Mr. Kee B, who just came to Boston as a Consul General
It
of
is
Boston.
indeed a great honor and privilege for me to welcome you to Peace on the Korean Peninsula in the 21st Century, a roundtable. This is the very first event that I attend and congratulate in my capacity as a Consul General of the Republic of Korea in Boston. I would also like to extend my sincere gratitude to the Boston chapter of the National Unification Advisory Council for its effort to hold this roundtable, and to today's panelists for sharing their insightful views with us. Ladies and gentlemen, I think it is very timely to hold today's roundtable to discuss the way forward to peace on the Korean Peninsula as the recent US presidential election just ended. Recently, President Moon congratulated Joe Biden on his election. President-elect Biden said that South Korea is a linchpin of security and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific region, and that he is deeply committed to South Korea's defense and will work as a close partner to address the North Korean nuclear issue. As a reliable ally, the Korean government will work together with the incoming US administration to further cement the ROK-US alliance and to continue to develop strong bonds between our two peoples. We will also work together more closely on pending global issues, including the fight against COVID-19 and the response to climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, US-North Korea relations has literally gone through tumultuous ups and downs and are now almost in a stalemate. However, even in this tricky situation, building on the achievements and experience accumulated to date, our government will pool wisdom with the incoming US administration to make further progress in achieving denuclearization and establishing peace on the Korean Peninsula. Distinguished participants, I hope that today's roundtable will be an excellent platform for creative ideas as well as insightful analysis of the prospect of the peace on the Korean Peninsula in the 21st century through open and thought-provoking discussions. I'm convinced that will immensely benefit from the expertise and insights of our panelists today. Before concluding, I wish NUAC Boston chapter all the best for the continuing success. I thank you once again for your participation and look forward to fruitful discussions. Thank you.
Now, finally, I would like to add special thanks to Mr. Casey Choi Chae-Kwang-Chul, who is the president of the KPAC and the representative member of the NUAC USA. We don't have his congratulatory speech today, but we all know your heart-filled congratulations on this forum. Thank you. Let me introduce tonight's moderator. It's my honor to introduce tonight's moderator, Professor Seung Jeon. Seung Jeon received her PhD in comparative literature from Harvard University. as well as a master's and a bachelor's degrees from Seoul National University. She has taught languages and literatures at Seoul National University, Kyunghee University, and Harvard University, and is currently a professor of Korean at Boston College. Also, an acclaimed translator of Korean and English literature. Her translations include the 2016 Man Booker Prize winning novelist Han Kang's Convalescence and Conscience in Action, the autobiography of Kim Dae-jung, the authoritative autobiography by the 2000 Nobel Peace Prize winner and late South Korean president. A long-time democratization and peace activist. She has been serving as co-president of the Massachusetts Korea Peace Campaign since 2018, and as chair of the Public Diplomacy Committee of the Boston chapter of NUAC since August 2020. Please welcome tonight's moderator, Professor Seung Jeon.
Hello, everyone. It's so great to meet you all today, and thank you so much, Professor Han, for that generous introduction. It is now my honor and privilege to introduce today's distinguished speakers. We have today an incredible group of remarkable speakers, leaders in fields related to peace on the Korean Peninsula and around the world, whose dedicated activities add up to almost a century of experience. We'll first hear from our distinguished panelists, then I'll ask just a couple of questions of them and open it up for questions and answers from the audience. If you have a question, please write it in the comments on YouTube, and we'll collect and deliver them to the panelists at the end of their responses to my question. We would also like you to introduce yourselves in your comments. Our first speaker is Professor Ed Baker. Professor Baker has a BA from Colby College, a JD from Yale Law School, and an MA in Regional Studies from Harvard University. He was a staff member of the Subcommittee on International Organizations in the U.S. House of Representatives during the investigation of Korean-American relations in 1977 and 1978. He was also Associate Director of Harvard Yenting Institute for 25 years and taught East Asian and Korean history at Hanyang University and Seoul National University from 2007 to 2010. A founding member of the board of Asia Watch in 1985, he was Amnesty International's U.S. South Korea coordinator from 1979 to 1991. He frequently writes and speaks on Korean affairs, and in recent years has taken a strong interest in promoting a peaceful solution to the division between North Korea and the US and South Korea, leading to the eventual reunification of Korea. Now, without further ado, please welcome Professor Baker.
Good afternoon. I'm going to speak briefly today about 4 points. The first point is the role of the United States on the peninsula. The second is Obama's strategic patience. The third is Trump's actions and words and actions. And the fourth is what can we expect that Joe Biden will or can do? The US role. Most Americans think that everything that's wrong in the Korean Peninsula is the fault of North Korea. I think this is simplistic, and it ignores the fact that the United States has been at fault as well. The U.S. I'll give a few examples. The U.S. introduced tactical nuclear weapons into the peninsula in 1958, despite the fact that it was a clear violation of the armistice agreement. The U.S. has often flown nuclear-capable B-52s and B-1B bombers in the vicinity of North Korea, making them feel threatened. And as the Pentagon said in 2013, this sends a strong signal. And a textbook case of how not to operate, in my opinion, was the Banco Delta Asia fiasco. On September 19th, 2005, as a result of the six-party talks, the US and North Korea signed an agreement that was the best agreement that they have ever signed. And at the same time, the US Treasury Department forced a bank in Macau to freeze North Korean accounts. The result of this was that negotiations broke down in October 2006, while things were still suspended. North Korea conducted its first nuclear test. Who knows what might have happened if that agreement had been able to go ahead. As a result of these things, North Korea has a rational fear of the United States attacking it with nuclear weapons. And a very clear, firm assurance will have to be given, I believe, if anything is to really be accomplished to move in the direction of peace. I'm a Democrat and a supporter of President Obama. And yet I have to say that I think that strategic patience was a mistaken policy which accomplished nothing. And the Leap Day Agreement of 2012, which was the one time that they tried to go beyond that, failed because of a North Korean attempted satellite launch. And as when that caused the agreement to break down, and the Obama administration did not go any further. I think they should have really tried much harder. Trump, point 3, at the beginning, spoke with the harshest of threats, the fire and fury that, like the world has never seen, will be visited on North Korea. The United States will totally destroy North Korea if it doesn't get its act together, shape up, whatever. As he said in his UN speech in September 2017. And I was really afraid of what was likely to happen. But then, thanks to President Moon Jae-in, Trump was persuaded to agree to talk with Kim Jong-un. And this led to the Singapore summit. And that summit, which was conducted in a cooperative fashion, led to a four-point agreement That was not a be-all and end-all kind of agreement, but which was a start and could have been built on. Another summit was held in Hanoi in February 2019, and it failed. It failed rather miserably. It ended early because when Trump and Kim Jong-un got together, supposedly to come up with the final agreement for the summit, Kim Jong-un offered to close down the Yongbyon facility in return for some sanctions relief. Trump said, no, we have to have complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization first, or there will be, before there can be any sanctions relief. What will or can Joe Biden do? As I've mentioned, I'm a Biden supporter, but I certainly hope that he will not attempt to go back to strategic patience. President Biden and President Moon had a conversation recently in which they committed themselves to working together to strengthen the alliance and to promote peace on the peninsula. And I think that's good, that's promising, that's an improvement over what's been happening with between Trump and Moon Jae-in. But what does it mean? I hope that it means that they will follow up on the start that was made in Singapore. I'm sure that Moon Jae-in would be happy if that could be the road ahead. In the second presidential debate, Biden denounced Trump's relationship with Kim Jong-un, but he said he might talk with Kim Jong-un if assured that North Korean denuclearization was in progress or in the offing. Joe Biden, a nuclear-free peninsula, and I think we could all agree that that would be a good thing. But we have to realize how different the views of North Korea and the United States are about what constitutes a nuclear-free peninsula. The attitude of the two parties toward the nuclear umbrella over Japan and Korea is certainly different and will be very hard to negotiate. In order to accomplish something in the direction of peace, I think the United States must recognize the reality that North Korea is, practically speaking, a nuclear-armed state. I don't mean that it should be recognized under the NPT as a nuclear power, but we will not make practical decisions if we don't recognize that. I think it has to be a step-by-step approach, as was agreed in September 2005. And there must not be preconditions, particularly not the precondition of denuclearization, because that will fail. Denuclearization has to be a goal, not a precondition. Real, credible security guarantee for North Korea is absolutely necessary. I believe that we should keep the emphasis on peace to improve the awful North Korean human rights circumstances, situation, North Korea must be, in my view, incorporated into the global system of international relations. First, we must avoid war on the peninsula for both humanitarian and human rights reasons. I think a good way to start a dialogue would be to try to work toward negotiating an end to the Korean War, a peace treaty. For example, we could start by passing House Resolution 152 that calls for an end to the Korean War. I think it's important to keep in mind that negotiating an end to the Korean War is not a concession to North Korea. It is not a favor for North Korea. It is a sensible way to end the tense situation that faces us all on the Korean Peninsula. This is particularly dangerous, of course, for South Korea and North Korea, but it is dangerous for the world. Moreover, I believe that negotiating a peace settlement on the peninsula would be a necessary first step on the way to denuclearization of the peninsula. Without the above sorts of measures, I think that failure is inevitable. Perhaps even war can develop. Even with such measures, it will be difficult to negotiate even to a peace treaty, but perhaps eventually a peace treaty and denuclearization can be accomplished. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Baker, for sharing your astute observations and suggestions. They're all the more powerful being based on an in-depth knowledge of the issue of peace on the Korean Peninsula. Let me now introduce Mr. Cole Harriosn, who is the Executive Director of Massachusetts Peace Action, a grassroots peace organization that is part of the National Peace Action Network. He also participates in the Korea Peace Now Grassroots Network and the Massachusetts Korea Peace Campaign. Welcome, Mr. Harriosn.
Good evening. I am Cole Harriosn, Executive Director of Massachusetts Peace Action. We are the state branch of the largest grassroots peace organization in the United States, and we work to abolish nuclear weapons, end U.S. overseas interventions through wars and sanctions, and cut the Pentagon budget to help the people. We call for the United States to stop dictating the future of Korea and to get out of the way of the Korean people's desire for peace and reconciliation. I thank the National Reunification Advisory Council for inviting me to speak to you tonight. Of all countries in the world, Korea has faced some of the hardest challenges in developing its national independence. As a medium-sized country caught between larger and more powerful neighbors, Korea has long been subject to intervention by other powers. The quest for national unity in Korea is a thread that runs through its modern history, and both the South and North Korean governments are committed to the goal of reunification. Although Korea had been a single unified kingdom for hundreds of years, it lost its independence and it became a Japanese colony from 1905 to 1945. After World War II, it was divided into North and South. Korea became a focal point in the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, between capitalism and socialism. The Korean War devastated the country with hundreds of thousands of dead on both sides and millions of civilians killed. Tens of thousands of American soldiers died in the Korean War too. North Korea ranks as one of the most heavily bombed countries in history, and the Korean Peninsula remains heavily militarized today. The Korean War ended in 1953 with an armistice, not a peace treaty, so that the question of Korean reunification has been locked in a military confrontation since that time. The US has maintained a large military force in South Korea for 75 years. At present, 28,500 US troops are deployed there on 15 different bases. Geopolitically, the US sees South Korea as a base to project US power on the Asian mainland in opposition to Russia and China. Under US occupation after World War II and the Korean War, the US installed politicians who had risen to prominence under Japanese rule. South Korea continued as a right-wing military dictatorship for decades, and it has become more democratic after bitter struggles, including the Gwangju Uprising in 1980, which was put down with the assistance of the US military. North Korea, for its part, tried to maintain self-reliance, or juche, rather than becoming dependent on either of its two socialist allies, the Soviet Union and China. Then, with the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, North Korea's security concerns intensified further. Fearing US regional military hegemony, it moved to develop a nuclear energy program starting in the 1980s. North-South US relations seesawed back and forth in the 90s and the 2000s. The agreed framework in 1994 called for normalization of relations, and President Kim Dae-jung's Sunshine Policy put in place cultural exchanges, economic cooperation, and reconciliation. But the George W. Bush administration ended the agreed framework. North Korea tested its first nuclear weapon in 2006, and conservative government in South Korea ended the Sunshine Policy. The UN imposed severe sanctions on North Korea since 2006. There was little progress under Obama, but in 2017, Moon Jae-in ran for president of South Korea on a platform of reinstating the Sunshine Policy, and he won a decisive victory. Trump became president of the US the same year, and his America First foreign policy sought to end unnecessary American foreign commitments. After threatening North Korea with fire and fury, Trump reversed course and met Chairman Kim Jong-un in Singapore in 2018, signing an agreement to establish a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. Presidents Moon and Kim met 3 times that year and agreed on a variety of confidence-building measures. But progress towards peace stalled after the Trump-Kim Hanoi summit in February 2019 failed. But because both Democrats and Republicans in Washington continue to say that North Korea must eliminate its nuclear weapons before peace and reconciliation can begin, Trump tried to redefine this dead-end policy, but his Secretaries of State Bolton and Pompeo were not willing to carry that out. President-elect Biden then ran to the right of Trump in their final debate just a month ago on October 22nd. He attacked Trump for meeting with Kim Jong-un before he denuclearizes, and he compared Kim Jong-un to Hitler. But we have another view. North Korea has good reason to fear US military attack. Our bombers destroyed North Korea's cities in the 1950s. We fly nuclear bombers near Korea, and we conduct threatening war games. And our military is tightly integrated with South Korea's military. In fact, the South is protected by US nuclear weapons, so it is not accurate to state that the North's nuclear weapons have upset the military balance. What they have really done is make the military balance a bit closer to equal. And now the North is struggling to use the breathing room it has gained to develop its economy and improve the lives of its people. The military confrontation is preventing political progress. even though both North and South Koreans want reconciliation and a peace treaty to end the Korean War. The forward US position in Korea is a relic of the Cold War. It's perpetuated by ossified thinking in Washington. It only makes sense in the context of US empire, in which the US seeks to maintain its position as the dominant power throughout the world. Now, 30 years after the end of the first Cold War, the US is moving towards a dangerous new Cold War with China, political, economic, and military. The US presence in Korea is now a part of US military moves to encircle China, with a chain of alliances and bases stretching from India through Vietnam, Japan, Taiwan, and Korea. Biden helped develop this encirclement in the Obama administration. And now that Trump has moved towards decoupling the US and Chinese economies, Biden will face the temptation to further mobilize US power against China. Korea is likely to be caught in the middle of this deteriorating regional situation. So, is there a basis for a movement in the United States to end the Korean War? I think there is. The impasse on the Korean Peninsula cannot last forever. It frustrates the national aspirations of the Korean people, who need to put division behind them and move towards reconciliation and peace. And from the point of view of most ordinary people in the US, why should the US be so deeply committed in South Korea? The US would immediately be drawn into any war that started there. American casualties, both soldiers and civilians, would mount, and use of nuclear weapons would be a serious danger. We've already seen US military spending rise rapidly during the Trump administration, from $767 billion in 2016 to $936 billion in 2020. Yet the US economy is being hollowed out, and we need that money at home to provide jobs, healthcare, housing, education, and a clean environment for the American people. So it would be more than prudent for America to get out of the way of peace negotiations between Koreans and follow their lead towards a demilitarized Korea. We need to defund the empire, bring US troops home, and stop interfering with the Korean people's aspirations for national reconciliation. These ideas are gaining traction in the political mainstream. Mass Peace Action participates in the Massachusetts Korea Peace Campaign, which is an affiliate of the Korea Peace Now grassroots network. We work with Representative Ro Khanna, who has introduced a resolution in Congress calling for an end to the Korean War. That bill, HRS 152, now has 51 co-sponsors in the House of Representatives, including Representatives Jim McGovern and Ayanna Pressley in Massachusetts. We have met with the staffs of all Massachusetts members of Congress, asking for their support, and we are hopeful that we will make even more progress next year. We also support a relaxation to sanctions, an end to US military exercises in South Korea, and an end to the ban on travel to North Korea. Thank you for organizing this program tonight, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Harriosn, for sharing your perspectives on the Korean Peninsula in the context of a US-led world order and the US people's need for their own domestic well-being. Our next speaker is Dr. Kee Park, who is a faculty member at the Harvard Medical School, where he studies the complex geopolitical factors that influence health in North Korea and the relationship between international security, health, human rights, and health diplomacy. His recent publications include The Human Cost of UN Sanctions and Funding Shortfalls for Humanitarian Aid in North Korea, and Injuries in North Korea, Addressing a Looming Crisis. As director of the North Korea program at the Korean American Medical Association, Dr. Kee Park has visited North Korea more than 20 times since 2007 in support of North Korean medical doctors. His last visit was in November 2019. Dr. Park is also a member of the National Committee on North Korea and the Council of Korean Americans. In addition, he serves on the expert panel on surgical care at the World Health Organization. He has appeared on PBS, CBC, Arirang TV, CNA, and has been cited in the New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal. He received his MD from Rutgers Medical School, MPH from the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, and neurosurgical training at Temple University Hospital. He's a diplomate of the American Board of Neurological Surgery. Please welcome Dr. Park.
Thank you, Seung and the Boston chapter of the National Unification Advisory Council for inviting me to speak today. The theme of today's webinar is Peace on the Korean Peninsula in the 21st Century. Well, you probably know by now that I'm a surgeon who has worked alongside North Korean doctors in Pyongyang since 2007. And you may be wondering, what does peace on the Korean Peninsula have to do with surgery? To be frank, I also questioned the role of doctors when it came to geopolitics. As a surgeon working to improve the lives of North Korean people, it was convenient for me to put blinders around me and focus only on medical care. I would say things like, I hope the politicians can figure out how to achieve peace. They do their job and I'll just do my job. Well, this talk is about how I came to reject that notion that doctors have no business in geopolitics. In fact, I now believe that doctors have a fundamental responsibility to be advocates for the health of people. In the North Korean context, I contend the failure to achieve peace has had steep human costs. And when it comes to peace, health is one sector that is easy to find common ground and opportunities for cooperation, which can in turn lead to trust building and a path to peace. Having grown up in South Korea and then in the US, I enjoy the social benefits that we all enjoy as citizens of prosperous and wealthy countries. But things could not be more different in North Korea. In terms of wealth, South Korea's GDP is estimated to be 40 times that of North Korea. When we compare the state of health, the situation is grim. Although the number of mothers that die during when giving birth has been decreasing in North Korea, still mothers in North Korea are 8 times more likely to die during childbirth when compared to mothers in South Korea. How about life expectancy? The people in North Korea will die about 10 years earlier than the people of South Korea. My motivation to help the people of North Korea is simple. It arises from my natural instinct to take care of others. I think this is why I went to medical school. When confronted with these disparities between the two Koreas, I felt compelled to do something about it. My first trip to North Korea was in September of 2007. I was introduced to neurosurgeons at Pyongyang Medical College, the top medical school and hospital in North Korea. When they welcomed me, they also seemed a little bit skeptical of my intentions. And later I found out why. Many people have gone to North Korea only to take pictures and then use them for self-promotion. They make all sorts of promises, but they don't return. This makes the North Koreans naturally suspicious. When I returned the following year, and every year since, they began to trust me and allow me to see patients and operate with them. This was a real privilege, as I got to see the actual conditions the best doctors in North Korea were working under. Let me just say that I have the utmost respect for these doctors. They're highly professional and conscientious, and we share the same mission to do the best we can to take care of our patients. It didn't take a long time for me to understand their needs and how to best support these heroic doctors. And after a few years, I began to gradually question the root cause of the difficulties these doctors faced in caring for their patients. It wasn't due to lack of knowledge or skills. They're excellent surgeons. It wasn't even that they lack resources. The country has resources. I think I just read an article that they're sitting on top of trillions of dollars of natural resources. But the country's poor. And they desperately want to grow their economy, but they couldn't. Why? And I believe the root cause is the failure to achieve peace on the Korean Peninsula. Because of the ongoing state of war between North Korea and the US, North Korea prioritizes national security over everything else. And I've heard more than once from North Korean diplomats and officials. In Korean, they will say, 박기범 선생, 우리는 지금 전쟁 중입니다. What that means, it literally translated means, Dr. Park, we're in the middle of war. They don't say we have a ceasefire. They actually say we're in the middle of war. And this is kind of the mentality they work under. And it is this fact that they see themselves as in state of war with the US, the greatest superpower in the world, and who during the Korean War had dropped more bombs in North Korea than it had in all of Pacific Theater during World War II. This is what motivates them to develop their nuclear and missile programs, even at a steep societal and economic costs. They see it as a matter of national survival. It is my opinion that without some level of security assurance that cannot be easily reversed, Pyongyang will not agree to any reduction in their nuclear capability. For Pyongyang, changing the intentionality, perceived or real, of the US is the key. But for Washington, they are singularly focused on removing DPRK's nuclear capability without sufficiently addressing DPRK's fears. The decision by the North Koreans to become a nuclear state has had serious implications on the health of its people. In response to the ICBM and the sixth nuclear test in 2017, the UN Security Council for the first time passed sanctions targeting civilian economy of North Korea. They also capped fuel imports to 10% of previous year's imports, or around 500,000 barrels per year. To put this in context, Australia, which has a similar population as North Korea, imports this amount in a day, and Australia actually produces oil. And it was at this moment in 2017 that I decided to break my silence and speak out on the harm that these sanctions will have on the ordinary people of North Korea. I did face accusations of being pro-North Korea. I still do. But these comments are negligible. What I didn't realize that there were so many more people and organizations who were concerned about the people of North Korea and the unintended consequences of these sanctions, not only in the North Korea context, but other countries as well, such as Venezuela, Yemen, Syria, Iran. What I stand for is peace. Peace is a prerequisite for health. Let's be clear. These sanctions kill. Our study looking at just the UN agencies and their inability to fulfill their intended programming due to sanctions and funding cuts in North Korea in 2018 showed that as many as 4,000 people could have died in that year. And most of them, over 3,000, were children under 5 years of age. And let's not forget how these sanctions also prevent North Korea's ability to care for their people by preventing them from procuring certain medical equipment and supplies. To me, this is simply immoral, especially now when the world is facing the worst pandemic in a century. Let me shift the gears now and use the remaining time to talk about the prospects for peace and how health diplomacy could play a role. In some ways, the pandemic has created an opening to restart the peace process. All countries, including the US and North Korea, recognize that global health security is only as good as the weakest link. No one is safe until we're all safe. Therein lies the opportunities for cooperation among traditional adversaries. I'm sure you'll recall that President Trump has offered assistance to Chairman Kim. Chairman Kim sent a message of support to President Moon Jae-in when South Korea was dealing with its outbreak early February. Now, although these messages are a good first step, in reality, the provision of aid and cooperation with DPRK counterparts in health faces multiple layers of challenges due to the extensive sanctions regime, the most restrictive ever in history. What will be needed before any meaningful cooperation can be realized is a major reset in the way humanitarian conditions are addressed. And I have the following 4 suggestions. First, the reset must be comprehensive and address the issue of currently non-existent banking channels, as well as logistical and regulatory barriers. This may require a partial rollback of sanctions, both at the UN level and unilateral sanctions. Second, a multi-stakeholder approach is the key for the political continuity and mitigation of undue influence by any individual key actors. Third, the financial package should be large enough to get everybody's attention. Small fragmented projects are unlikely to gain any traction. And finally, the program should begin immediately with support for pandemic preparedness, with the provision of massive testing capacity and medical countermeasures such as ventilators, oxygen generators, and other medical equipment. And this should also include guarantees for COVID-19 vaccine when it becomes available. Will these steps lead to peace? Maybe. Should that deter us? No, because helping North Korean people is the right thing to do, regardless of diplomatic benefits. The provision of humanitarian aid where and when there is a need is a moral imperative, full stop. Having said that, I do hope that diplomacy can resume and make progress toward peace on the Korean Peninsula as a result of the major reset on addressing humanitarian conditions in North Korea. Thank you.
Our final, but not the least speaker is Mayor Paul Heroux. Mr. Paul Heroux is the mayor of Attleboro, Massachusetts. He was a state representative for 3 terms before being elected mayor. He spent 10 years in North Korea in 2013, and he has also lived in Saudi Arabia and England. He worked for the Institute for Defense and Disarmament Studies in 2004 and 2005. Mr. Heroux wrote about international affairs for the Huffington Post for 5 years. He has been a regular contributor to RT International, and he wrote Aftermath of Intention, the U.S. Legacy in the Middle East. He has an MA in International Relations from the London School of Economics, an MA in Public Administration from the Harvard School of Government, an MA in Criminology from the University of Pennsylvania, and a BA in Psychology and Neuroscience from the University of Southern California. Please welcome the mayor.
And as somebody who had studied international relations at the Harvard School of Government and London School of Economics. Some of the things I learned in North Korea, I put down in an article for the Huffington Post in 2014. And I'm going to read largely from that article to form the basis of what my contribution will be to this roundtable on North Korea. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea is often in the news for stories of behavior that defies conventional norms of human rights or international relations. The point of my article is not to rehash all the negative things that have been the subject of North Korea in recent years. The point of my article was to suggest what I observed and learned as a guest in North Korea and how that can be useful in the study of diplomacy. And perhaps more importantly, what the public should look for in our political leaders to determine if they are acting in our best interests. If we have criteria that we can hold our elected officials and their appointees to, if we can determine if they are on a path to success or failure. When I visited North Korea, I went on an 8-day tour with colleagues, classmates from the Harvard School of Government and Harvard Business School. We went for one reason, and that was to learn. using a Chinese tour company, we entered North Korea from Beijing in August of 2013. We were told that there is an estimated 60,000 tourists that visit North Korea each year, of which are about 2,000 from the United States. While we were there, we were brought to museums, monuments, farms, a bowling alley, the beach, universities, parks, restaurants, homes, a public transportation system, which was the subway, the resting place of the Kims, the mass games, and more. We traveled in a tour bus all over the country, moving from one place to another. We were able to see what the conditions are like for people living in rural and urban communities. Toward the end of the week, we were granted permission to talk to locals and even dance with them. In short, we were given the red carpet treatment. People often say that we only saw what the government wanted us to see, and that's true. And that's fine. We still saw more than most of the critics. And to put it into perspective, if a group of North Koreans came to the United States as guests of our government, and we were showing them around, and the State Department was their host, they would probably see some of the same things that we saw. We would not bring a group of North Korean tourists to visit inmates on death row in prison, or our poor neighborhoods, or visit our military facilities. Now, there were two major takeaways that I feel are especially important when addressing diplomacy with North Korea. The first is that the Kim family is revered like no other, and I can't stress this enough. We visited the birthplace of Kim Il-sung. It was like visiting Bethlehem. There was a straw-thatched roof, peaceful music playing in the background. It was a serene environment. Everywhere you go in the country, there are portraits of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. The people speak of them with godlike reverence. When I mentioned this to our tour guide, he quickly corrected me and said, no, they're just the chairman. And I said, yes, but you respect them like Christians respect God or Jesus. And he said, yes, absolutely. The second thing, and this is very interesting, the U.S. started the war with Korea, and according to the North Koreans, they won it. This is a matter of national pride. There are numerous exhibits that are offered as evidence of the U.S. defeat, and that was something that was just all over the country. They're still living in the 1951 to 1953 war. The question then becomes, how does the international community deal with North Korea? So the lessons from inside North Korea that I took away are, considering the cultural and political atmosphere of the country, we need to ask, how could we even start to break an impasse with North Korea? And there are several ideas. The first is, don't talk about regime change. This will only discourage the political leadership from working with the international community. Also, appreciate their concerns. Preserving the Kim family rule and saving face are necessary elements to working with North Korea. Understand and respect the power and reverence of the Kim family. The Kim family is omnipresent in their culture, politics, and daily life. Respect their power. The North Korea country is a nuclear-armed nation and with the world's largest standing army. 1/3 of their GDP is spent on the military. They have an extensive web of security and intelligence services that permeates all levels of society. We can't buy that sort of influence. Start small and talk about shared interests. Finding small things to agree on is one good way to develop a rapport and trust, which are necessary elements for bigger negotiations. We should expect setbacks. North Korea and the international community do not trust each other. Accordingly, there will be times when progress is followed by the inevitable setbacks. This should be expected to be part of the path to success. We should also admit when a mistake is made. There is perhaps no better way to undermine trust and confidence in a political negotiation than to dig one's heels in when a mistake has been made. Admitting mistakes is an act of humility and respect, and this is something we should do on our end, and we should also encourage the North Koreans to do. Lastly, understanding Juche. Dictating terms and conditions to the North Koreans is a sure way to accomplish nothing with a nuclear power who is committed to the Juche ideal. Juche is as much part of the North Korean identity as freedom and independence are a part of the American identity. North Korea is not deterred by threats of isolation from the international community. They pride themselves on their self-reliance and independence. Now, lessons from a diplomat. There are two ways we can look at lessons from one of my professors at the Kennedy School, which was Nicholas Burns. We have metrics for failure and metrics for success. Let me first go over the metrics for failure. First, we have to learn how to not deal with North Korea. And one of the things was that failure will come when we limit our discussions to our own self-interests. Also, failure will come when we don't anticipate the consequences of our behavior or tone. Also, we must want peace to get it. If we want war, we will get that. Looking backwards does not help forward movement. Knowing when to wait and when to build international support depends on the situation. Getting this wrong will lead to failure. When diplomacy and force are not combined, it undermines strength. So those are some of the metrics of failure. Some of the metrics of success include having a strategic vision for success. We have to have a plan. What does success look like? What do we want to accomplish? We have to have identified tactics and build a team to accomplish this strategy. Each team member is responsible for the implementation of the different tactics. Compromise is always at the heart of any solution. Putting oneself in the other's position is necessary to ask how we may be wrong. Without this, we may be aggravating a situation. Psychology and international relations are intertwined. If we don't appreciate the culture and religion and mindset of the nation that we're dealing with, we are going to be set up for failure. For many nations and cultures, saving face is very important for concessions to be made. And lastly, we need moral courage. We need to ask if we are going to go all the way and do the right thing, even if it is unpopular. To successfully navigate any impasse between two powers, we have to remember the words of Sun Tzu. Know thyself and know thy enemy. Those are some of the things that I had observed from my 8 days in North Korea and reflected on those with the education that I had from the Harvard School of Government and my professor Nicholas Burns, who was an ambassador and the third highest ranking person in the State Department. As I said, I'm not an expert on North Korea, but having been there, I had a little bit more of an insight about what it was like inside the country than before I had visited previously. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion on North Korea at this roundtable.
In foreign relations. My apologies for misspeaking of the time you spent in North Korea. It's 10 days, not 10 years. Thank you to all our panelists. I must say this was an enriching and enlightening exchange with such detailed knowledge about the 7+ year history of contemporary Korea since the end of World War II, with wisdom coming from firsthand observations and involvement, as well as personal experiences as leaders of US relations of many countries, including Korea. Unlike the single-minded mainstream focus on the denuclearization of North Korea, you have opened our eyes by helping us to see the whole issue of peace on the Korean Peninsula from historical, geopolitical, humanitarian, and foreign relations perspectives. What stood out for me from today's talks was our need to see this matter not only from our perspectives, but also from the perspective of North Korea. Then we can realize that the fear of the US, the most powerful country in the world, is rational and should be accepted as a realistic precondition for any sort of engagement with them, because the Korean War, which destroyed 1/5 of its population, has never actually ended for them. High-level, intensive military exercises and war games are happening under their nose regularly and annually, and harsh sanctions damage their lives more and more by the day. I agree with your points about the necessity of North Korea to have a realistic and substantial security guarantee from the US before any sort of productive dialogue can happen. Your talks also reminded us not only that the regime of current sanctions is a humanitarian disaster which calls for an urgent reset, but also that the current pandemic could open up a new opportunity for productive dialogue with North Korea about peace and reconciliation on the Korean Peninsula. My question is for all the panelists. I know that a lot of Americans, both leaders and lay people alike, think that despite all your arguments and points, negotiations with an unpredictable dictator known for oppressing his people is an irresponsible act which could lead nowhere, as President-elect Biden's camp often seems to suggest. Some people also say that sanctions have worked and that a show of strength is the only way to handle such a troublemaker, quote unquote. I wonder how you would respond to that argument. My second question is related to what Mr. Cole pointed out about another Cold War having been brewed between the US and China and Russia, and that therefore assisting Korean people in their effort to achieve peace on the Korean Peninsula is essential in this very dangerous scenario. There's also tension developing between Japan and Korea, which began with the issue of how to deal with a colonial legacy, but has spread into the areas of economics and politics. I wonder if any of you could comment on this situation and how important it would be for us to achieve peace on the Korean Peninsula in order to prevent a full-blown catastrophic event, not just in East Asia, but also in the world. Any of you? Yes, Professor Baker? Unmute yourself, please. Unmute.
I clicked many times on the microphone and it didn't work.
Now we can.
Okay, you can hear me. Well, I think that the possibility of a war breaking out is with us every day. There's heavily armed, extremely heavily armed troops on both sides of the border, on their toes for any false moves on the other side. And if a war starts on the Korean Peninsula, it will spread because the United States obviously will be involved. China has a mutual defense treaty with North Korea. I don't see how anyone benefits from a situation that maintains this tension. It is true that if we negotiate with North Korea, we may not get anywhere. I think we have not been getting very far in the years up until now. But it's not entirely North Korea's fault. We have often not kept our agreements either. And it is just reckless of us or foolish of us to think that, oh, they're irrational, they're crazy, they're unreliable, so we won't negotiate with them. Instead, let's stand with a gun at each other's head and see what happens. And that's what we're doing.
Okay, thank you. Mayor Heroux?
Yeah, thank you. To the point about negotiations, it's often said that you don't negotiate with your friends, you negotiate with your enemies or somebody you want something from. A negotiation means that everyone gets something, but no one gets everything. And I think that's one of the things that we need to keep in mind when we're negotiating with North Korea, if an administration wants to go forward with that. But to the point about an irrational regime. While they may be irrational from our point of view, and I believe they are, the collective consciousness within that country is that they are right. And as I said in my intro, they believe that the United States started the war in North Korea on the Korean Peninsula, and they believe that they won that. And so it's important for us to work with whatever worldview that they are operating under, because if we don't work with whatever worldview that they are operating under, pretty much everything we're going to do is going to go in vain.
Thank you. Other, Mr. Cole, Harriosn?
Well, I would just say that U.S. just has to get over the idea that by threatening North Korea and sanctioning North Korea, that we're going to get a positive response. So many decades of history shows that that is not the case. That does not work. And we're just digging the matter deeper and deeper. And some confidence building measures would be appropriate. One problem is that our military exercises that we used to do every year with South Korea, then it was suspended and then it came back and so on. And now I think they're talking about resuming it again this spring. That would be a very dangerous step, and we should campaign that those exercises should not be held. The travel ban, that's a simple humanitarian thing. We can relax that travel ban, allowing Americans and others to travel to North Korea, especially for humanitarian purposes, but also for educational and cultural purposes. And then the sanctions should be relaxed, as Dr. Park was explaining. This will make a big difference practically to the people of North Korea, and it will also reduce tensions. And then in the longer run, we have to have the peace agreement. And this is the diplomatic and political position that we have to urge on the Biden administration. I'm afraid that it will not be easy to convince them, but hopefully they will take a new look at the situation and not be bound by the chivalrous of the past.
Thank you, Dr. Park.
Yeah. So this idea that we should not be talking to dictators is rubbish. U.S. has a long history of engaging with dictators when and if they want to, and it serves our national interests. It's double standards. Over the last 4 years, I think there's been a sufficient amount of data, information research showing the impact of sanctions to the point where I think there's a degree of interest, some interest in civil disobedience. So there was a situation in Iraq when they found out that the sanctions were killing children in the hundreds of thousands. Eventually, NGOs just flouted the sanctions. And that could happen now. In fact, there were two examples I can give you. The Chinese and the Russians are sending in COVID test kits, and they're not seeking humanitarian exemptions through the UN. They're sending it in saying, arrest us or do something about it, but they're just doing it without checking. And the last thing is I can't I want to just mention about the civil activism that's going on in this country right now, led by many of the Korean Americans, but also non-Korean Americans. The House Resolution 152, I know Casey Choi is on this call, but the women, the activism group, the Korea Peace Now group, they've got a bipartisan support for this bill now. They have a Republican sponsor for this bill. And I can't emphasize how important that kind of work is in trying to change the mentality of the U.S. government.
Thank you so much for your thoughtful answers. Your points are well taken. As we do not have much time left, listening to your words, which we cannot afford not to hear, I'd like to open up this time now for a couple of questions from the audience. Our staff member gathered some questions, and I see a couple of threads that seem prominent. One question is that this event is hosted by the Boston chapter of the National Reunification Advisory Committee Council, and Professor Baker mentioned reunification between South and North Korea. But I have heard that the South Korean people, and in particular, a majority of younger generation, are not that interested in reunification. All they're interested in is living peacefully. Is that true? Do you really think the country should be reunited? Isn't that a threat to the power balance that's existing in East Asia? Another thread I have is I heard that President-elect Biden wants to work with our allies and would not put pressure on South Korea for sharing the military burden as President Trump did. But I think that the Trump administration made a good argument about sharing the military burden. Why do we, the US, have to take on the military burden for South Korea, since we American people are also suffering from a lack of healthcare, housing, food, and a worsening environmental situation, as Mr. Harriosn pointed out? Could you comment on these questions briefly? Yes, Professor Baker.
On the one about younger South Koreans losing interest in or not having any enthusiasm for reunification, I'd like to note that Moon Jae-in's popularity skyrocketed when he held successful meetings with the North Koreans. And why would that be? It's because people actually have perhaps mixed feelings if it is going to hurt an individual's own prosperity, if they think it is. But basically, I think Koreans are interested in unification.
Thank you. Other speakers? Yes, Mayor Heroux.
Point about the second point where you had asked, or the line of thinking was, why would we support another country when we have problems at home domestically? It's quite simple. The government, whether it's local, state, or federal, has the ability and even obligation to multitask, and that's something that I think a lot of people think we can only do one thing at a time, or we can only focus on one thing at a time. I know from my time in government that we do multitask. We have to multitask. We have to focus on more than one issue at once. So I support, that multi-pronged approach to government administration.
Mr. Harriosn?
Well, yes. Still, our federal government spends something like 57% of our tax dollars on the military. So yes, it is true. We can do Operation Warp Speed and provide some funds for coronavirus, but we are spending the great bulk of our taxpayers' dollars on the military. And that is because our military has a footprint all over the world and is dedicated to being the dominant military power in the world and facing down any threat. And it doesn't matter whether the threat is a country like Iran or North Korea or China or whatever they consider. Any country that does not do what the United States government wants to do is seen as a problem. And the response is a military one. And it's bleeding our nation dry. It's taking a huge amount of our resources. And just to touch on the side of the relation with China, now we have been fighting, we have pretty much been fighting in the Middle East for 20 years. So now, and the Obama administration tried to turn our confrontation of our military over to China. Now, the Biden administration may do it again. And they are determined, instead of cooperating with China, to compete with China on all levels. And it's a terribly expensive proposition. It's expensive economically, as now the world internet will be divided into two parts because the US government doesn't want to cooperate with China. And the military expense will be staggering. And I'm afraid Korea will not face favorable conditions to resolve its problems if the US and China become more and more hostile. I hope Korea can still play a positive role by the two parts of Korea reconciling. It will at least help in the regional situation also.
Dr. Park?
Yeah, so there's this sort of an obsession about reunification, and I would just caution about getting involved in that discussion because we don't have the conditions for reunification at this point. I think from a sequencing standpoint, it makes perfect sense to talk about ending the war, and then talk about what's the next step. But right now, just to get in a discussion about reunification gets a little bit distracting. And I would also point out from a health standpoint, the pandemic really is a great reset. It's making governments reevaluate their spending priorities. And this is an opportunity. I mean, I know Harriosn and I share this whole, this whole idea that military spending has to be scaled back, and I totally agree with him. And as you know, the military industrial complex is entrenched, but the pandemic, I think, has really upended a lot of things, and it's an opportunity, and we should really, use it to the best of our abilities.
Well, thank you so much again for those thoughtful answers. We have so many more questions, but unfortunately, we have to wrap up this eye-opening and truly motivational discussion. I thank our panelists sincerely for sharing their insights and expertise based on their decades of dedicated work to promote peace and human rights. It has been a highly productive discussion, shedding light on the path of our future work to accomplish peace on the Korean Peninsula and for the greater good of all human beings. Before we end, I'd also like to ask our audience to keep their eyes and ears open for our future forums in 2021, which we hope will bring long-awaited progress in this situation, along with so many other urgent issues in our society and the world. Before this year is over, though, we do have another forum next month, led by one of our committee members, Ms. Kumju Lee, to be held on Saturday, December 12th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. She will be sharing her own firsthand observations of North Korea from a recent visit there, as well as moving stories of her own family's separation ever since the Korean War. I'd like to end this forum with one last announcement. As you might know, California Congressperson Lucana last year presented House Resolution 152 calling for a formal end of the Korean War, which has so far gathered 52 co-signers, including our own Massachusetts members of Congress, McGovern and Presley, as well as all three candidates for the House Foreign Relations Committee chairmanship. As this resolution is automatically discarded at the end of this term, we understand that Congressman Lucana is preparing another resolution in a similar vein. We are also aware that a few other bills and resolutions are being prepared as we speak for the relaxation of sanctions and the travel ban against North Korea, and the streamlining of humanitarian assistance for that country. We plan to work closely with House members and hope that all of you can join us in our efforts as we advocate for these congressional actions. Thank you again, our audiences, for making time during your weekend with a lot of time gaps technically. And thank you to our technical team and Boston NUAC leaders for their hard work in making this forum possible. I hope you all stay healthy and safe in this difficult time until I see you again in our next forum. Thank you.
This is a wrap-up for this evening's event. So this forum will be available on Boston NUAC YouTube channel. Special thanks go to the National Unification Advisory Committee, Consul General of Boston, and unsung heroes, those who put into their great efforts to make this forum as the best one. Thank you for watching. Please take care of yourself and each other.